Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today's webinar. I'm Brent Struthers from Neustar, and I will be the moderator today. A couple of housekeeping points. We are doing this all via voice over IP. So be sure to turn up the sound on your speakers on your computer. And if you have any audio or technical difficulty, click on the help widget at the bottom of the screen. You should be able to see it down there. It has a question mark, and it'll cover common technical issues. For those of you who may want to try and email me during the call to ask me questions, I'm not going to be watching my email, so don't do that. If you're unable to resolve the issue or have any questions during the webcast, you can also click on the Q&A widget, and we'll figure out how to help you from there. Let's see. We're going to try and answer as many questions as possible during our Q&A session. If we go long and we can't answer all the questions, we will send answers out afterward to everybody. So let's see. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A at any time, and we'll keep logging those, and we'll ask the questions at the end during the Q&A period. We have an on-demand, or we're going to have an on-demand version of the webcast later, and it'll be sent to your email actually in the next few days. So if you want to send it around to anybody, you can. Others can access it later. So there you go. That's the initial particulars. Ken Paulitz. Ken Paulitz is going to be our presenter today, and I'm going to show you Ken's awesome Vegas picture. Ken has been working at Neustar for a long time, almost as long as me, but he's been here for a long time doing a whole lot of different things. And right now he is leading, and he'll give you some of his background as well. But he is leading our development efforts in our caller ID spoofing and illegitimate robocalling solutions area. So Ken is smart. He knows what he's talking about. I was really glad to be able to get him for this, and hopefully he can provide information that you guys are looking for. So Ken, I'm going to hand this over to you, and I'm going to go on mute.
Okay, well, thanks, Brent, and welcome to everyone. I hope everyone had a great holiday weekend, and welcome to the webinar on preventing illegitimate caller ID spoofing and robocalling. I'm thrilled to be with you today for the next 30 to 45 minutes or so, talking to you from New Jersey. I have been in the telecom industry for coming up on 34 years. The last 7 have been with Neustar, and most recently, like Brent said, I've been focused on this issue of industry solutions for how to best manage illegitimate caller ID spoofing and robocalling. Before we get into the meat of it, I would like to just go over some definitions, and I know we have probably a pretty broad audience, so I'm going to try to keep this fairly high level, so hopefully we don't lose anybody. We mentioned caller ID. So what is caller ID? So caller ID is a calling feature that will display the associated telephone number or the telephone number and the name of the person making the phone call. In the U.S. today, the name of the caller has been typically provided by third parties that are queried as part of the call from the different service providers. And Neustar is a dominant player in providing the name of the caller that gets displayed on many of the phones that you may have or that are out there in the United States. So caller ID is that calling feature. The number is pretty much transmitted through the network, but then typically on the terminating side of the phone call, there is a query to get the associated caller name that goes with that number. Now, caller ID spoofing is really a practice of impersonating that caller's identity by using a valid phone number to defraud that person. Typically, that's what we would call illegitimate caller ID spoofing, is when the attempt is to impersonate and defraud the call-in party. And we'll talk more about that. Robocalling is really a technology that really just automates calls, right? So we're having machines generating very high volumes of calls instead of human beings actually dialing or making phone calls themselves. And we've seen quite a rise in robocalls. There's 35% of all calls in the U.S. are actually robocalls, which is a pretty high statistic. And when combined with fraudulent spoofing, this leads to pretty massive phone crimes. We have some statistics. Now, one thing I do want to point out is I did mention illegitimate as part of the title of this webinar. It's very important to note that there are legitimate uses of these technologies today. I mean, a simple example is that, all telemarketing is not necessarily illegitimate or bad. So there are good actors out there that are using these technologies, but obviously there are bad actors that have been increasing in scope to use these technologies in ways that are not legitimate. And that adds complexity when you think about the solutions for addressing this problem. So you need to keep that in mind as part of any solution design so that you're not stopping good activity, but you can still identify the bad activity. And here's some statistics, just from a third party, actually. Besides just the increase of these either complaints or just the volume of these types of calls, there are dollars that you can tie against these. These were reported by another party, but two that I'd like to point out since they get to the financial aspects of things is the $8.6 billion that's lost in the last year alone through fraud of consumers and businesses. And in just responding to these types of illegitimate calls, a waste of productivity in the order of $475 million across small businesses. So there is a heightened awareness and visibility, as we all know, and we all can relate to almost personally, that we need to do something here. And what we'll talk about is, how did we get here, and where is the industry, at least currently, going to help address this? And of course, everyone is looking for the silver bullet. Unfortunately, I don't think there is one, at least for the time being. I don't know if there ever will be one, but the good news is that there are multiple techniques out there that I think if used together, we can go a long way to addressing this problem in most cases. And the silver bullet, people look for the silver bullet, but the media attention continues to grow. And the point of this slide is really to just show that this attention is down to a local level, as in the newspaper article on the top right. That was from my local paper here in New Jersey, to things like Consumers Union and USA Today. Ultimately, with this combination of techniques, we still may not eliminate all of these illegitimate calls, but the idea is to suppress these to a much lower level and also deter folks to using potentially other technologies, which there'll still be bad actors that will still want to do things, but if we can deter them from using the phone network and also suppress these to a small enough level, we should be able to be in a much better position as we move forward. So how did we get to this position? If you look at the voice or a phone call over the years, the phone call itself has not really changed in let's just say, almost 20 years. We may make a mobile phone call versus a landline phone call, but the phone call itself has just not changed too much. The business itself is fairly profitable, and there's still 3 billion calls a day made in the U.S. alone. But some of the new technologies and the use of these illegitimate spoofing and robocalling technologies have also led to some poor user experience in the way that they've lost a lot of trust in actually wanting to pick up the phone call. I'm sure all of us think twice about answering a phone call at home and increasingly even on our mobile phones. The business impact is fairly significant, and this statistic here, which says 97% of business calls to consumers go unanswered. So obviously people are just losing faith and trust without knowing who the person is that's calling them to do and conduct legitimate business in a B2C environment, business to consumer environment. So what's key here is we're looking at a trusted identity and a broader context of who's calling you to empower the end user to make much better informed decisions and trusted decisions in whether they answer the phone or not. And this is not much different than the evolution of what we went through with the Internet and the World Wide Web. You want to make sure that you're first reaching any site that is associated with either the web address that you are given or the site that you're clicking on, and making sure that that is the site that you are intending to be at. If you're using a Windows computer and an antivirus software like let's say Symantec or the Norton product from Symantec, they have a concept of a safe web rating. So you have an idea or indicator that says that someone has actually done some validation that this is actually the website and it could be a trusted website. Taking that one step further, if you're making any sort of a transaction, especially a financial transaction, you want to make sure that that is a secure transaction. So two things there. One is in many cases, there is a trusted authority that has actually validated that source, and you may through a certificate, or you may see VeriSign or something else posted associated with a financial website. And we also look for the HTTPS, or a secure version of the standard protocol that's used on the World Wide Web. That HTTPS signifies that that is an encrypted transaction between your computer and the transaction site, so that no one is actually injecting or intercepting that and doing something fraudulent. So it's these same concepts that are now being looked at by various industry organizations and participants to bring into the phone network. It's a logical evolution. We've gone through it with the Internet and the World Wide Web. We went through it with email, and it's not that. Again, by putting some of these things in place, we've been able to actually suppress the level of bad actors and bad activity associated. So we'll talk about as the approach that the industry is taking here, and give you some insight into the time frames when we might be able to start seeing some of these technologies get introduced to our national phone network. Now, there are a suite of mitigation techniques out there today and even proposed. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if we look at the middle of the slide here, a typical phone call will go through at least the originating provider. And if the phone call is not to someone on that originating service provider network, it will go through maybe an intermediate network, maybe multiple intermediate networks, maybe no intermediate networks, but ultimately it will go to a terminating service provider, and then that call gets delivered to the call-led party, person receiving that call. The calling number is, as you'll see on the bottom there, is injected on the originating side of the phone call, and the calling name, as I mentioned earlier, may or may not be inserted on the originating side, but in the U.S., in most cases, it's inserted on the terminating side of the phone call. And people have looked at different technologies that can be used in the yellow to address this at different points in that call path, from the intermediate side out to the originating side and to the terminating side. The most common are solutions that are out there today, typically fall into the category of blacklists and whitelists. And these are lists that usually have some form of a user control, but really what they contain is a list, a mostly static list, which can be updated from time to time, of numbers that are viewed as either legitimate in the case of a whitelist or illegitimate in the case of a blacklist. However, the problem with some of these solutions is that, especially blacklists and whitelists, is that the bad actors out there are pretty sophisticated, and they can usually spoof and get hold of a broad range of numbers that they can use on an IP network, and they can constantly change these numbers. So it's hard to keep current with a blacklist, whitelist type of approach. But in some cases, it can be effective, for known numbers and things. And the original intent was really for people just to control a little bit about who someone doesn't want to get a call from their ex-wife or their ex-spouse. But this has evolved into something a little broader in terms of identifying illegitimate phone calls. Now, Neustar's focus is in the area of caller ID, as I mentioned earlier. And if you're interested in understanding the definition of some of these other techniques, there is a slide at the end of the deck which gives you a little bit of an overview, a little bit of a definition around some of these that are fairly talked about. Now, one thing you might ask, and think about is that, we have things in place that should deter this right at the calling parties on the left side of this diagram. If we can just keep we have things in place that should keep the bad actors out, but that alone, it may not be working as effective as we would like. So there's do not call registries. There's the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Act. And an interesting little quote I picked up from Money Magazine. It was an interesting reply to the do not call registry. But the point of the call is that, the point of the quote here is that these techniques alone are not going to be sufficient as we move forward, as the bad actors have gotten more sophisticated. But it was just an interesting call that an interesting quote that came out in a national magazine.
Ken, are we planning to do a follow-up with Mr. Crum once we get our testing done? The joke, Ken. Back again. No, we're not going to do a follow-up with Mr. Crum. Sorry.
Okay. All right. I see that now. I forgot that Michael Crum was the person who sent that quote in. Okay. All right. So Neustar has introduced a concept, or an overarching concept of Smart ID, and we see this as an opportunity to kind of reinvent the caller ID that we all have come familiar with over the years. This is typically either a number and or a name, but the name has been limited based on current technology to about 15 alphanumeric characters. The approach under the Smart ID concept, and these are, think of it as three legs in the stool. There's three components. The mobile devices and other devices give us a much broader landscape to work with in terms of displaying context and indications of verification of the calling party. So the first leg of the stool is what is referred to in the industry as enhanced calling name. An enhanced calling name is the ability to provide a richer set of information that could be displayed on different devices to give people more context around who may be calling them and why. And you'll see a little example on the phone there. The one that's most talked about is, American Express. Someone got into your American Express and they're calling you with a valid fraud alert, and you're not really sure whether you should answer that or not. So with this rich context, this can be more vividly displayed and give that information for a person to be more informed about whether they want to answer that phone call. The second piece of this, which we'll talk in more detail about, is the caller verification. So even though I have all this nice information about American Express and they're trying to tell me about a fraud alert, how do we really know that was American Express that placed that phone call? And that's what gets into the area of the second leg of the stool, which is the caller verification, or what we're calling certified ID. And we'll talk more about that. The third leg of the stool, and we'll refer to this a little bit later, is the broader set of analytics on taking information that's coming from these different services and looking for calling patterns and identifying areas for robocalling and being able to identify those kinds of patterns. Neustar alone supports about 10 billion calling name lookups per month. So that's a pretty good sized data set to start looking at across the spectrum of the U.S. phone network for a basis of building on some analytics capabilities. The certified ID will also provide us another set of analytics to show which providers are actually using these technologies and give us a traceability back to the person who actually originated the phone call, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about that so you can see how that works. It's important that we look at this cross-platform. So we are, looking at ways with the existing technology, the broader and richer landscapes of other devices like televisions as well as mobile devices. So the intent here is to provide a common look and feel across a person's multiple devices in this area. Okay, so we're going to shift to the certified ID. This is the concepts of the internet that we were talking about, the transactions, secure transactions, making sure that this is the right website. So what we're going to be looking at here is industry efforts designed to making sure that the person calling is who they are, and the fact that this call has not been tampered with as it's been delivered to the other end of the network. And there's two organizations that have been driving these efforts. And the first is called the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force. This is a very engineering-focused organization. It's a very open organization where almost most participants and most companies can participate in. And the efforts associated with this initiative are falling under two concepts. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. The Internet Engineering Task Force website is just www.ietf.org. And the two, if you're interested in this level of detail, the two efforts are what we call STIR, which is called Secure Telephone Identity Revisited, and Passport, which is Persona Assertion Token. And just think of this as a token is going to contain the identity claims for that phone call, and STIR is going to show how to transport that token over an IP network to the terminating side, and also to encrypt it with a signature that can be used by the terminating party to validate the call. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is kind of at the engineering level. But what it really will do is provide the equivalent of the Norton Safe website and the HTTPS type protocols, and also like a VeriSign assured site, or a caller in this case, on the terminating end. So that's kind of the parallel here. The IETF has an engineering focus, as I mentioned, and their mission is to make the internet work better. I mean, that's kind of their tagline. Now, ATIS is the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions. This is a group, this is a membership organization, mostly of service providers and some third parties that play a pretty active role in the telecommunications. So Neustar is also a participant of that. They look at the underlying standards that are being written in the IETF, and they look at an implementation plan on how this can actually be deployed across the different networks that are out there. On the Internet Engineering Task Force, this STIR and Passport initiative, there is a member of Neustar who is actually co-leading these standards with some others in the industry. And then on the ATIS side, myself personally are involved in the groups here involved in actually starting to test and actually design implementation approaches. The other group I should mention here is an interesting document has been published from this ATIS organization by the Calling Party Anti-Spoofing Landscape Team. I do see it posted on their website, and I'm not sure, sometimes they charge for these documents, but it's a white paper that actually gives a nice overview of the problem scope, the problem area, the mitigation techniques that are out there, the pros and cons, and kind of a summary of some of the information that I'm presenting here. If you go to ATIS, www.atis.org, and then go to their document center, you'll see a link there for a anti-spoofing robocalling white paper. And I don't know for sure whether it's available to members for sure, but I'm not sure if there's a small charge for non-members. But if you're looking for a good read on the landscape and where things are heading. If you can get that for free, even better. But I know they don't charge too much for their documents. Okay, so what is certified ID? So I would say we're talking about a digital signature here, and really what a digital signature is, it's a mathematical scheme for demonstrating the authenticity of a phone call. There's an algorithm that's involved. There is what's considered a private and public key. It's operating under existing infrastructure that's used to support the World Wide Web today, and a valid digital signature will tell the party receiving the call that the call was made by a known caller. Someone has actually validated that this is a caller, a subscriber on their network, and other potential checks. It's from a assigned phone number, things like that, and that the caller cannot deny that the phone call was made and that the call was not altered in transit. So really achieving those same kinds of concepts we talked about with browsing on the internet and making financial transactions. This is a developing solution. I mentioned before that we're participating in and leading many of these industry groups. And certified ID, as I mentioned, is just one component of a complete solution. Okay, this is not a silver bullet, but in conjunction with a broader context, some analytics, maybe even in conjunction with some of these other mitigation techniques like blacklist and whitelist, you start to pull together a fairly comprehensive solution that should deter and suppress the volume of illegitimate calls that we're seeing today. Now, one of the things we've done to promote the adoption of this, and again, it is still in its early stages because standards are, all the folks designing standards have well intents, they're engineers, but again, you've got to actually get some real life experience with these standards and the implementations or the potential implementations of these standards. So we've recently launched a certified ID lab. It's actually a little broader in scope than just certified ID, but this is in support of the industry. This is an open initiative that we are looking to get others in the industry that want to start getting hands-on experience with these standards and actually begin testing, looking at different use cases, and try to promote the commercial adoption of this in an expedited fashion, as opposed to some of the frustration I know some have had in terms of the lack of, or what seems to be a lack of movement in terms of putting these solutions in place. Our formal testing is going to begin this month. We have several parties that have already committed to the testing, and we're just in various stages of getting connectivity, just spelling out the test cases in a little more detail. And the formal industry position right now is that the adoption of this is to really target by the end of 2016. We're trying to move that up and be as aggressive as possible in helping folks. The good news here from a solution standpoint is that we don't feel that you need everyone to jump in at the same time. This technology will allow us to have some people adopt. They can start using the services to authenticate calls on the originating side, even if they're not even if they're not verified on the terminating side initially. You can start seeding the network with some of these capabilities. Now, I see one slide was out of place here. I should have said this. I should have mentioned this before, but just as here's an instantiation of what certified ID would actually look like. It really signifies trust in the call and the information that's being displayed to you. And one way of instantiating this, you can see here, would be on a mobile device. We can use something like a green. You see the lock with the green circle as a certified call, and on the red with the with the lock and the line going through it. This would be potentially how this could be displayed on a mobile device. I'll show you a slide at the end from some of the work in the lab where we can actually look at ways to do this with the traditional limitations of the 15 characters as well. So apologize for that, that this was out, that one slide was out of place. So go focus back on the certified ID lab, we've tried to spell out a number of benefits to providers and other participants. We think this is a fast prototyping environment. We're using Agile as a development to pretty much roll out new capabilities in different scenarios, like on a 2-week cycle. So those that participate with us, they can benefit from that. There are different ways to implement these standards. Any IETF standard from the Internet Engineering Task Force is not necessarily a detailed implementation. It's not going to work for everybody, so there's some interpretation and some things that have to go around that. The other benefit is that, as I mentioned, we have someone who's co-leading the work in the underlying standards. So as we work with people in this lab environment, we can feed that right back into the standards groups that are finalizing some of these standards. And there's going to be a series of industry use cases. There could be some atypical cases that may not have been thought about initially and things, and we just need to be able to identify those and understand the limitations and manage expectations around these capabilities. And ideally, there might be some new industry partnership opportunities to help, again, accelerate the adoption of this in ways where one party may bring some benefits, another brings the other benefits to get this out in an accelerated fashion. So, as I mentioned, in our lab, we've been working with the traditional caller ID display, which is working within the existing 15 alphanumeric characters that is in the current network today. And what we've done in this case, if you look at the phone on the right there, it's receiving a call. It's gone through these standards implementations of authenticating and verifying, and what we've done is we put a check mark in front of the existing caller name that's associated with this phone number. And we've registered this with actually a service provider, the name of NSR Lab, Neustar Lab, and the extension, and we pre-pended that with a check mark. Now, this doesn't mean it has to be done this way, but what this does show is that we can work with existing limitations to display some added value right away, right? So we don't have to wait for everybody to agree on how to display it on a mobile device. We can come up with something fairly simple, and with the right education and awareness, consumers and businesses and others can start seeing whether these calls are actually being certified to them, and they will start to get the benefit of this capability when they want to decide whether they want to answer a phone call or not. Okay, so spent the last 30 minutes kind of going through this. I could probably talk for hours on this, but let me try to summarize some of the key takeaways from what I've presented so far, and you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions if you'd like. One key takeaway is that, and you'll hear it from the industry organizations too, is that no one really feels that there is a silver bullet here. This is an evolution. It's going to be a set of techniques, some of which are available today and some of which are still in the early stages of being tested and actually implemented. The testing, we should start seeing testing based on the industry standards from IETF and the implementation work of ADIS in this month. We're optimistic that that's going to start, probably in earnest in another week or so, with a couple of different parties that are definitely anxious to move forward here. And the initial commercial adoption, we're hoping to be before the end of 2016. So about a 6-month period of testing and hopefully some initial adoption by some of the more aggressive participants. And there's a benefit here. I think there's an opportunity to, show the industry that they're serious to, help address this solution or this problem with this solution. And we're hoping that they'll engage and help move that forward. There are a lot of factors to consider. There's cost. We're trying to come up with a solution that's fairly low cost. performance implications. If someone makes the phone call, we can't have that phone call sitting for an extra 3 or 5 seconds before it rings on the terminating end. And other impacts, which I won't identify here, but you can get a sense that it's a complex problem. The implementation experience is necessary. That's why we're really promoting the lab. Again, the standards are standards. They're on a piece of paper. They have not been fully validated. They're written by very smart engineers and designed by very smart engineers and technical folks in the industry. But at the end of the day, once you start implementing and testing across different participants, you usually learn some other things, and that's the phase that we hope that will start in earnest this month. As with the internet and things we talked about, there's a trusted authoritative identity data. So if we're using authorities to certify a particular signer of phone calls, so a signer could be like an AT&T or a Verizon, a Comcast, or any of the service providers, we need an authority to validate and certify that, okay, Comcast is authorized to sign phone calls, here's their credentials, and then on the receiving end, the provider on the far end will be able to look at that information and determine that, okay, I trust Comcast, and I've also decrypted this digital signature, and it matches based on the mathematical scheme that I mentioned earlier, and that they can then present that to their consumers with other information to make a much more informed decision. And over time, as more of these phone calls are actually signed and verified on terminating side, our hope is that this will restore the trust of folks that are both making and especially receiving phone calls. The preferred approach that I hear is always empowering the user on the far end to make the actual decision on whether they want to answer or block a call or do. I think the service providers don't want to be in that position of making those calls unless it's a very extreme case where it's causing a serious degradation on their network or some type of international threat. But generally, the preference is to provide the call-ed party or the person receiving the phone call with much broader set of information, richer set of information, trusted set of information that they can then make the decisions themselves. Talked about the analytics. I mentioned that by looking at 10 billion calling name transactions over a course of the month, you can gain insights into some of the calling patterns that are happening out there. If you look at the certified ID solution, you'll also get an indication of how many calls are being signed, how many are being successfully verified, and other types of statistics that you can then build into the back end to actually provide insights, a broader set of insights into these types of potentially illegitimate calling patterns and such. And as we adopt these solutions, collectively, we're going to need a solution awareness among the public, support from a lot of different parties, and some education so that we put these things in place, these solutions in place, that the folks that are actually using and making phone calls can actually know what things mean and how to respond to those. Some of the solutions that are out there today that actually there's applications that you can download on the mobile device. Personally, I've tried a couple of these and they are not easy to use. So there's an ease of use factor here that has to be incorporated so that people who are going to leverage these technologies and solutions, it's easy enough for them to use these. We make it complicated, then they will just not use the technology, and then we really haven't gotten much ahead. So I think with that, for those you may or may not be familiar with Neustar, I'm just going to flash this here. I'm not going to go through this. We are a publicly traded company. At this point, I appreciate your patience and attention, and I'm going to turn it back to Brent then for the Q&A portion of the webinar. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Ken. And we do have a bunch of questions, so as my computer decides to try and crash here. we're going to go into the Q&A, and if you have more questions, we've got a bunch of them here. But if you have more questions, feel free to type them and send them in. First question, I'm going to go. I think you had one question on calling pattern analysis and heuristics, and I think you went into that a little bit, so I'm hoping that answered the question. Let's see, the next question is I'm not sure we can answer this entire question. The question is, how do you convince carriers to incur the additional expenses of these measures while foregoing the revenues they might get from carrying the traffic from the illegal callers? I'm not sure that Neustar can convince the large carriers to do anything, but hopefully the carriers have enough incentive to fix the issues here, because they are getting the bad publicity and having the cost of having to deal with a lot of the fraud as well. And Ken, do you have any more to put in on that one?
Yeah, I think the only thing, I mean, again, it's a tough question to, like you said, fully answer. But I think if you look at the incentives, I think the key will be on the terminating side, right? On the originating side, typically you would think, the originating provider does have an incentive to keep their customers happy, send traffic through the network. But I think on the terminating side, that's where we'll have to focus on making sure that the providers who are terminating calls, which are also originating calls, but they see on the termination side the benefit of eliminating, identifying these, and having happy customers on the terminating side. Hopefully, can swing a little bit more adoption on the originating side. So there's a kind of an imbalance on the commercial side of how it works today in terms of the incentives, but I think that's the hope, is that the people will start seeing the benefit of happy customers on the terminating side, and then see the benefits of it in putting this in place on the originating side as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go back a little bit to some of the calling heuristic stuff that we talked about, the data analytics that you talked about. How can you tell if a particular robocall is legitimate or not?
Yeah, so I think just based on volume, you're going to have to do some different levels of analysis. You're right in that just because a call has a higher volume doesn't necessarily mean that it's illegitimate. What we've seen with some known illegitimate calls that we've actually went back and tracked the calling name activity against, it gets to be fairly there's a cyclical pattern. I mean, there's more than just the volume. There's actually a kind of a pattern, that a signature, of a pattern of how these calls get placed, that actually give you that would notch this up to, let's say, a higher score level of potential illegitimate use. The thinking around the analytics as such is going to be combining with maybe some other data sources, but also giving maybe a scoring algorithm based on certain criteria that would give different indications, right? So you might have pretty much from known to something that's you're not sure, but in that middle area, you might be able to provide some grading and tune that grading over time based on the different types of analysis that you do. So we're still in the mix of looking at the data and how best to look at the data and how it aligns. But one of the ways we've been doing this is actually getting known. Customers ask us this, here's a list I know of illegitimate calls. Go back and look at your data and tell me what you see. And it's kind of revealing actually in terms of what you can see and how it's more than just the volume, that you can start to identify things that may actually be much more suspect than you would initially think, just based on the volume alone.
So it's not 100% black and white, but you definitely see, you begin to identify patterns the more you look at the data.
There's a heuristic aspect to it, which the more data and better heuristic and analysis, can be tuned over time. But it's not going to be always black and white. That's true.
Okay. Next one, we actually have, I think, three questions in one, so let's do one at a time. What criteria is used to determine the certified status of the originator of the call?
Oh, great question. So from the standards perspective, it's left a little open in terms of how far you go with this, but you can visualize that the originating provider it's receiving a call. They can check their own internal systems in terms of whether this is a valid subscriber. They could check to make sure that this is an assigned number. It's not just a number in the inventory that maybe someone spoofed or not. And you can think of maybe other checks that they can do. So none of that is fully defined in terms of the range of things that they can do. So depending on what mix they do, they will then be signing or certifying that that is one of their users and it's a valid user. And based on the identity of who signed that call on the terminating end, that provider or whoever's interpreting that can then again assess whether this party does enough that says I'm going to always going to consider this verified, or again factoring into a scale or a ranking scale. They may be able to show that it was not tampered with. It's been sent through the network, so it's certified to that extent. They can also, on the terminating side, there's a check against their certificate. So there's different things that they can check to make sure that the certificate is not revoked. They can check to see on the terminating side whether that is still an active number based on public sources or private sources, depending on who's involved in the solution, to say, is this still an active number from that provider? And you can actually do some checks on the terminating side as well. So you don't have to rely fully on the originating side, but it's a good question in that it's not all been defined. What needs to be checked on the originating side. Some of that is a little bit open for implementation details at this point in terms of what people agree.
Okay. Let's see. Can multiple numbers be blocked from the same originator?
Multiple numbers be blocked from the same originator. Well, the identity we're looking at is associated with a number today. It's not necessarily associated with the individual, right? So I think the answer is yes, in that the identity that's currently been defined to validate starts with the telephone number of the calling party.
And
now,
I think this may be getting to the originator not being able to get one call through using one number and then switching up numbers to see if they can try and get a call through that way.
Well, yeah, so if they are able to get a hold of numbers that a provider will originating calls for, and they may be assigned, assigned and active numbers, or they just could be from the pool of inventory that a provider has, and they got a hold of these and they're just trying them. They may or may not do them in any kind of a sequential order. They may just do them typically they're just random. But again, the solution right now is based on the number, not necessarily the person behind the number. That's not to say that you would not be able to leverage other data sets in this process to enrich the context and trust factor back to the consumer. So, for example, there's other information that folks have about individuals associated with phone numbers. Now, that's not part of the base solution that people are looking at, but that data can be leveraged in various ways. And again, you may start to get into some privacy kinds of things that we need to be sensitive to, but you can't. The technology would support the ability to get beyond a telephone number, I guess is what I would say. The solution right now has started with identity that is managed at the telephone number, though, only.
Okay.
Hopefully that makes sense, but again, there's other information that can be tied to a telephone number that can be injected into the solution but the core standard starts with the identity of the telephone number being validated and across the network.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, I'm going to ask you to get into the mind of the spoofer here for a minute. Can you tell us about the bad actors spoofing a company or person's own number back to them? Why would somebody spoof somebody's own number to them?
I've heard of that. I apologize. I just don't know that. I just don't know exactly why that would happen. It's some kind of a reflection thing. It's actually, I think, in that white paper I referenced on addis.org document center. If you can get access to that document, I'm sorry, I just don't know that specific use case well enough to comment.
I will only comment that I have heard that it creates a curiosity where somebody says, well, why would I be calling myself? And it kind of makes them want to pick up the call because it's interesting, although that's probably going to wear off as more people see that. So that's the only thing I've heard. Maybe, Ken, you're too straight-laced and I'm a little more criminal element-like. So let's see. I do have a couple more questions. What's the difference between, can you use the ANI as well as the caller ID? That's the same thing, right?
I believe so. Yeah, the whatever is used as the number, it should be the ANI as well. That's typically what is sent today as part of any phone call, and then what we're looking at is authenticating the provider of that phone number and the identity of the user, the identity associated with that telephone number, and then associating it with a rich set of information that can be trusted on the other end in terms of enhanced calling name type information.
Couple more questions. When you talked about the specifics of some of the illegal robocalls, the heuristics or analytics that point to illegal robocalls, is there anything that you can point to now which would be a characteristic of an illegal robocall that you would say, yeah, this looks like that, as you've seen some of the data?
It's been a little while since I looked in detail in the analysis that we recently did, but what we find is that you'll see repetitive patterns of high volume of calls on business days. So it's almost like a business. It's like a business day operation, Monday through Friday. You'll see spikes of activity like in the 9 to 12 time, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., 12 noon or something like that, or it could be a different interval. But what we're finding is I know we saw repetitive but consistent daily spikes of very high spikes of calls at almost the same interval of time and repetitive over a period of time. Now, they'll stop these usually after a week or two. This isn't going to go on for a month necessarily, right? I mean, they usually will move around and change numbers and things like that. But, I mean, typically, if I recall the analysis correctly, it was maybe like a week or two time frame of very consistent patterns during almost the same hours with very high spikes of activity.
Thanks. I love the Q&A because we get not only questions, but we got an answer sent in as well on the why people send their own number back, why people spoof somebody's own number. And the answer was to avoid blacklist because you're not going to put your own number on a blacklist. So that makes
very good.
Sense.
Yes,
Thank you for the answer on that one. We do these things not we teach people, but so we can learn while we're doing it. I have one last question here. Will there be any kind of report sent out with regard to the testing that Neustar is doing in the lab so we can see results?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if we fully thought through that. I mean, there's industry-sponsored testing that's going to be done through Addis. Not exactly sure how that's going to play out, but the participants in that testing have all signed an NDA. I think Addis, as the organization, then with some input from its members, will decide what level of analysis will come out of that. But I'm sure that they'll want to share progress since they're under a lot of pressure to promote and move along solutions in this area. As far as Neustar goes, I would think we would do the same. We don't have any specific plans yet. If it involves some of the participants with us, we may need to get their permissions and things like that. But I'm sure that at some level we can start to get some aggregate level information on how testing is going. We have, I believe, a blog associated with our caller ID program. So, we may post things there. Maybe we do a white paper. I'm not sure, but we just haven't fully decided yet on how we. It's not a matter of if. I think it's a matter of how.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's the last question. Waiting to see. Nope, no other questions. So that's the last question I have. I will say that if anybody has any other questions, here's my email address. If it's coming up here, there we go. So you've got my email address. You can follow up with me there. If you have questions about the lab and things like that, you want to know what's going on with that, just give me a buzz or send me an email. I'm happy to talk about it to the extent I can. And for those of you who will be at the AG meetings or the NARUC meetings, I will be at both of those coming up this summer, so you can catch me and grab me and ask me questions there if you want. Anyway, thanks for attending. Appreciate it. Ken, thank you for coming on and answering all the questions, and thanks, folks, for your questions.
Yeah, Brent, if I can just add one other note. If you want to see some information about the lab, it's pretty much, there's a dedicated page off of our caller ID page on our corporate website at neustar.biz. But you go to caller ID, look for caller ID, and then there's a certified ID lab page on there as well. So that might be a place where we might post things as we progress along.
If we can probably put a link, we're going to send the link out with the recording to the recording of this webinar to everybody who's attended. So we can probably put that link in with that same email, and everybody will get that. So great, thanks everybody again for joining. Appreciate it, and have a great day.